This podcast contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing content related to real-life events, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're getting into something a lot of you have been asking about, the early signs of serial killers.
Yeah.
You guys have sent in some really interesting stuff from the Crime Museum, some research from Tarrant County College, and even a Healthline article about the McDonald Triad.
Oh, interesting.
So I guess the big question is, can you actually spot a future serial killer? What do you think?
Well, that's a question I think a lot of people ask. And, predicting human behavior is really complicated. You can't just check off a list of traits. But there are definitely things we can learn by looking at past cases and the research.
Totally. It's not about deciding someone's going to be a criminal or anything, but just sort of understanding what factors might contribute to this type of behavior.
Yeah, for sure.
So before we get too far, how do these sources define a serial killer?
Well, they all kind of focus on a few key elements.
Okay.
It's someone who commits at least 3 murders. And these murders happen as separate events over more than a month with cooling off periods in between.
I see.
But the most important part is that the murders are driven by a psychological need or thrill.
Okay.
Not some other motive like, money or revenge or something.
So it's not just about the number.
Right.
But the why behind it.
Exactly.
And that brings us to probably the most popular theory, the McDonald Triad.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's heard of that one.
Animal cruelty, fire setting, and bedwetting.
Right.
So is it really the predictor that some people make it out to be?
Well, the McDonald Triad is definitely interesting, but it's more complicated than people think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been around for a while.
Yeah.
But more recent research shows that it might not be as accurate as we thought.
So it's not a, guaranteed sign.
Right. Not at all.
But it is interesting.
Okay.
I've definitely heard of it.
For sure.
But it sounds like maybe we shouldn't be using it as a checklist or something.
No, I mean, what's interesting is that these behaviors...
might not predict violence, but they do point to something else. Like what? Often a dysfunctional home environment.
So maybe instead of thinking, oh, this kid's going to be a criminal.
Right.
It's more about, oh, this kid needs help.
Exactly. Troubled childhoods, trauma, abuse. Those are all things we should be paying attention to.
Definitely.
And addressing,
Absolutely.
Early intervention is key.
Yeah.
Addressing those root causes of trouble.
Makes a lot of sense.
That's where we can make a real difference. Not just in preventing extreme cases, but just in creating a healthier society overall.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not like, every kid who sets a fire is going to become a serial killer.
No, of course not.
Right.
But if they're setting fires and they're coming from a difficult background,
Yeah.
maybe there's something we can do to help.
Right, and intervene early.
Exactly.
So if the McDonald Triad isn't really a for sure thing,
Yeah.
what other signs should we be looking out for? Well, they talk about a few other red flags.
Okay.
Things like consistent antisocial behavior.
Okay.
Like a fascination with fire that goes beyond,
Right.
just normal kid curiosity.
Yeah.
And also cruelty to animals, especially if it's repeated.
Yeah.
And it seems more about control than just not understanding.
So this is starting to sound a little more serious than
Yeah, for sure.
just kids being kids.
Definitely.
And it's interesting. I'm noticing this this theme here. It's not just about a one-off incident. It's about patterns of behavior that show a lack of empathy.
Exactly.
And just not caring about other people.
Right. Yeah, you're getting it. That's the key point. Is these behaviors, especially when they happen together, they could be indicators of a deeper issue.
Right.
And understanding those issues, that's really important if we want to get to the root of the problem.
So it's not oh, that kid's going to be a serial killer.
No, not at all.
But it's about recognizing when someone needs help.
Exactly. We're not trying to predict the future. We're just trying to make things better for everyone.
Okay, now I'm curious about something else.
Yeah.
How do serial killers choose their victims?
Ooh, good question.
Is it random, or is there a pattern to it?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what makes a serial killer tick.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting?
Yeah.
It often boils down to control
Okay.
and dominance and fulfilling this very specific vision they have.
Interesting.
It's not usually random. It's very calculated.
So creepy. Like they have this whole plan in their head, like almost like a fantasy that they're acting out.
Exactly.
And the victims are just
part of that fantasy.
Yeah, like pieces in their game or something.
Right.
God, that's so disturbing.
It is. It's a dark side of human nature.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand it.
Totally. And it makes me think, the choice of victim probably tells us something about the killer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like their wants, their desires.
Yes, their inner world.
Yeah, I'm really interested to learn more about that.
Me too.
Like how they choose these victims.
For sure.
And what that says about them.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So we've talked about some of the behaviors, things that might make you go, it's a little strange.
Right.
But what about the bigger picture? Like what makes someone, more likely to be drawn to this dark stuff?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nature versus nurture.
Yeah. Is it something you're born with? Or is it something that happens to you?
Right. And our sources don't really dive deep into the genetics.
Okay.
But they do mention one thing that seems to come up a lot.
What's that?
Childhood trauma.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Like if you experience violence or neglect when you're young, it's got to have an impact on you, right?
Right. And it's not just about the trauma itself.
Yeah.
It's how you cope with it.
Oh, interesting.
One source even mentioned that a lot of serial killers,
they've
experienced some kind of serious trauma in their early years.
Wow.
And so they learn to suppress their emotions.
Oh, so they just shut down.
Yeah. Or they struggle to form healthy attachments.
Right. Because they haven't had those positive examples.
And so they end up with these distorted views of relationships and power.
So it's like, instead of learning healthy ways to deal with stuff, they develop these really messed up coping mechanisms.
Exactly. And sometimes those coping mechanisms, they manifest in disturbing ways.
Like what?
Like the cruelty to animals we talked about.
Right.
Or fire setting.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to gain control in a world where they feel powerless.
It's so sad. It's like this vicious cycle,
Yeah.
Trauma leads to these awful behaviors.
Right.
And then if no one helps,
it can escalate.
It could get even worse.
Exactly.
So recognizing those signs and getting them help, that's so important.
It really is. Early intervention is key.
Yeah.
If we can create environments where kids feel safe and supported.
Yeah.
Where they learn how to, express themselves in a healthy way. And develop empathy.
Yeah.
That could make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And it's not just about preventing, the worst case scenario.
It's about helping kids thrive.
Exactly. So while we're talking about this, what about, the nature versus nurture debate?
Yeah.
Do the sources say anything about, whether some people are just born
predisposed?
Yeah, predisposed to violence.
They touch on it a little bit.
Okay.
There is some research that suggests certain genes might make someone more prone to violence.
Interesting.
But it's never presented as oh, you have this gene, you're going to be a killer.
Right.
It's way more complicated than that.
So it's not like you can just look at someone's DNA and be like, oh, yep, there it is.
Yep.
The serial killer gene.
It's a combination of things.
So genetics and environment.
Exactly. Nature and nurture working together.
Okay, so we can't just point to one thing and say, oh, that's why this happened.
It's a mix of a lot of factors.
Right. So knowing all of this, what can we as regular people, what can we do to protect ourselves?
That's a good question.
Are we just supposed to be scared all the time?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's not about living in fear.
Right.
It's about being informed.
Okay.
Remember, these signs we've been talking about, even when they cluster together, it doesn't mean someone is definitely going to become a serial killer.
Okay. That's reassuring.
It just might mean they need help.
Right.
It's not a prediction of their future.
So it's more about, being aware
Exactly.
of these potential red flags.
Yeah.
And, trusting our gut if something feels wrong.
Yeah, something feels off.
But not jumping to conclusions about people.
Right.
Just because they're a little different.
Right, exactly.
So it's about being observant.
Yeah.
But not, judgmental.
For sure.
Okay, and that actually brings us back to that Crime Museum article.
Yeah.
About victim selection. Understanding how serial killers choose their victims can actually help us stay safe.
It can. It can give us some insights.
Okay, I'm interested to hear more about that.
Yeah.
What kind of insights?
Well, the article says that serial killers They often prey on people who seem vulnerable or who won't be missed as much.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
Like they're looking for easy targets.
Right. They want control and dominance.
Yeah.
And they often choose victims who fit a certain profile.
That's so scary.
Yeah, it's chilling.
It's like they have this image in their head.
Yeah, this fantasy.
Yeah, and they're looking for someone who fits that.
Exactly.
God, it really makes you think.
It does.
About being aware of your surroundings and trusting your instincts.
Right. If a situation feels unsafe,
yeah,
it probably is.
It's not about being paranoid.
Right.
But it's about being smart.
Taking precautions.
Yeah.
Being mindful of your safety.
Especially if you're alone.
Or in a place you don't know well.
Exactly.
So understanding these patterns can help us make safer choices.
Right. It's about empowering ourselves to avoid dangerous situations.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've talked about like the individual factors and how they choose victims.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious about like law enforcement.
Oh, yeah.
What do the sources say about how they use this knowledge?
To catch these guys.
Yeah, to catch them and hopefully prevent these crimes.
Yeah, good question.
Okay, so we've talked about, you know, the individual stuff and how they choose their victims. But now I'm curious about the people trying to stop them, like law enforcement.
Yeah.
What do our sources say about how they're using this knowledge to like track down these criminals?
Well, one thing they definitely use is criminal profiling.
Oh yeah, profiling.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
It's a fascinating field.
I have to admit, I'm a little bit of a true crime fan.
Oh, yeah.
So I've always been curious about that. Is it really as dramatic as they show it on TV?
Not quite.
Like, can they really just look at a crime scene and be like, oh, this is who did it?
It's definitely not that simple.
Okay.
But the idea is based on real science.
Right.
Profilers use their knowledge of psychology, criminology, you know, all that stuff to analyze the details of the crimes.
So it's not like they have like psychic abilities or something?
No magic involved.
Okay.
It's about using logic and experience to narrow down the possibilities.
So like what kind of details are they looking at?
Well, things like the victim's profile, how the crime scene is laid out, the weapon they used.
Okay.
All of that can offer clues about the offender.
That makes sense. Like you could imagine different scenarios, right?
Exactly. Like a really organized killer who plans everything out versus someone who's more impulsive.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That would leave totally different clues.
Exactly. And that can help law enforcement a lot.
In what way?
Well, it can help them prioritize leads, decide where to focus their resources, and even figure out how to catch the killer.
So it's not just about solving the crime after it happens.
Right.
It's about trying to prevent the next one.
Exactly. If you understand the killer's patterns, maybe you can anticipate their next move.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
So they can be proactive.
Right. Like if they think the killer is targeting a certain type of person in a certain area,
they
can increase patrols there or warn people.
Wow. That's like using knowledge to actually save lives.
Yeah, potentially.
But I imagine profiling isn't perfect, right?
Of course not. It's not foolproof.
Yeah.
It's just one tool among many.
Okay.
And it often works best when it's combined with other investigative techniques.
Like what?
Like DNA evidence or just good old-fashioned detective work.
Right. So it's about bringing all those pieces together.
Exactly.
The science, the investigation, the gut feelings.
It's all part of it.
To try and solve these really complicated cases.
It's a complex puzzle.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that even though profiling can be really helpful, it's not about labeling people.
Right.
Or making assumptions based on stereotypes.
It's about understanding the individual.
Right. Using evidence to understand their behavior and their motivations.
So it's about seeking justice for the victims.
Absolutely.
Protecting the innocent.
And holding the guilty accountable.
I think that's a really important point to emphasize.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't been trying to glorify violence or anything.
No, not at all.
It's been about understanding.
Right. Trying to shed light on this dark subject.
Exactly. And figuring out how we can prevent these tragedies from happening.
I think that's what it's all about.
Well, this has been a fascinating depth dive.
Yeah, it really has.
I feel like I've learned a lot.
Me too.
We've debunked some myths, explored some really interesting psychology.
And we've learned about how law enforcement tackles these cases.
Yeah, it's been really eye-opening.
And if anything we talked about today sparks your curiosity,
I
really encourage you to keep learning, keep exploring.
That's a great point.
The more we understand about this stuff, the better.
Exactly. This is just the beginning of the conversation.
Right. It's an ongoing process.
So to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Keep asking those questions, keep learning, and until next time, stay curious.